The Black Death, also known as the Plague or the Pestilence, was a pandemic of the bubonic plague in Europe, Western Asia and North Africa between 1346 and 1353. It is known as the most fatal pandemic ever to have occurred in history, killing between 75 and 200 million people. The plague significantly reduced world population and is believed to have killed 30 to 60% of the population of Europe and around 30% of the population of the Middle East. The bacteria Yersinia pestis, found in fleas carried by rodents, is believed to be the cause of the plague, most likely being introduced to Europe by trade or across battle lines, decimating countries in a staggeringly fast space of time. Life for those living at this time quickly became one of devastation, horror and death. Certain testimonies can help us to understand what day-to-day life was like during this time, and how, even amidst the loss and devastation, life managed to carry on. Historians have used not only first-hand accounts, but also results of investigations carried out in subsequent years and centuries to gauge what daily life would have been like for both peasants as well as nobility during the plague, which spared neither. From looking at a number of sources, we can clearly see how daily life was anything but normal. Friar John Glynn was a monk in Kilkenny, Ireland, during this time. He wrote the book The Annals of Ireland, which gave an insight into life during the plague. He pessimistically left the pages at the end of his chronicle empty, in case anyone should be alive in the future. Glynn wrote, "There was hardly a house in which one only had died, but as a rule man and wife, with their children and all the family, went the common way of death," stating that 14,000 people in Dublin had succumbed to the plague by the end of 1348. Glynn would record the death of clergy who often became infected trying to help the sick. He recorded 25 dead comrades in Drogheda and 23 in Dublin. Every aspect of society was impacted. Streets became filled with the sight of corpse bearers. Sources of entertainment such as theatres emptied and graveyards filled. As one can imagine, people were often unwilling to come into close contact with those infected, tearing families and friends apart and giving rise to the grim jobs of plague doctors and corpse inspectors, who were given the tasks of dealing with the dying and the dead. These horrific sights soon became a part of everyday life. Plague pits would be built from brick, and people had to carry their dead to mass graves as there were not enough coffins to go around. Those households where a member was infected were marked with a white cross, and once this cross was displayed, no one was allowed inside, with many people dying alone, away from their loved ones. A man named Friar Michael of Pisa provided a further vivid description of the social scene at the time of the plague. "So did the plague increase at Messina, Sicily, that many sought to confess their sins to the priests and make the last testament, and the priests and judges and notaries refused to go to their houses, and if any of them did enter the sick men's houses for testimony or other business, sudden death came unavoidably to them. What shall I say more? The corpses lay abandoned in their own houses. No priest or son or father or kinsman dared to enter, but they gave rich fees to hirelings to bear the corpses to burial." Religion was a significant factor in daily life at this time. In response to the deaths of so many friars and monks, the Bishop of Bath and Wells released an appeal, stating, "On the verge of death, if they cannot have a duly ordained priest, they shall in some way make confession to each other, even to a layman." In medieval beliefs, a death without the last rites could well mean suffering in hell. Agnolo di Tura was a shoemaker and tax collector in Siena, Italy. His wife and 5 children would pass away from the plague. His chronicle of life during the plague is as follows. "The mortality in Siena began in May. It was a cruel and horrible thing. It seemed that almost everyone became stupefied seeing the pain. It is impossible for the human tongue to recount the awful truth. Indeed, one who did not see such horribleness can be called blessed. The victims died almost immediately. They would swell beneath the armpits and in the groin and fall over while talking. Father abandoned child, wife, husband, one brother another, for this illness seemed to strike through breath and sight. And so they died. None could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priests, without divine offices. In many places in Siena, great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of dead. And they died by the hundreds, both day and night, and all were thrown in those ditches and covered with earth. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. I, Agnolo de Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands, and so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. The book The Black Death by Rosemary Horrocks contains a number of quoted primary sources from those who witnessed these events firsthand, such as Westminster monk John of Reading. And there was, in those days, death without sorrow, marriage without affection, self-imposed penance, want without poverty, and flight without escape. How many who fled from the force of the pestilence were already infected and did not escape the slaughter? The book by Horrocks highlights the mood of catastrophe present in Europe at this time. To the chroniclers of Padua, the plague was a devastation more final than Noah's flood, when God had left some people alive to continue the human race. Belgian monk Ludwig Heiligen wrote that sea fish are now not generally eaten, men holding that they have been infected by the infected air. Moreover, no kinds of spices are eaten or handled, unless they have been in stock for a year. Francesco Petrarch was an Italian scholar and poet. He managed to outlast many of his family and friends who died from the plague. Much of his work explored the collective grief of society and the fragility of life in the wake of the terrible year of 1348. In his book Familiar Letters, he declared the year of 1348 left us alone and helpless from this plague without equal in all the centuries, and that the plague of this year has trampled and destroyed the entire world. A letter sent to his brother displays the anguish and suffering that he was enduring. Where are our friends now? Where are the beloved faces? What abyss swallowed them? Once we were all together, now we are quite alone. We should make new friends, but where or with whom? When the human race is nearly extinct, and it is predicted that the end of the world is soon at hand, we are, why pretend, truly alone. Giovanni Boccaccio lived through the plague in Florence, and wrote a play called Decameron, which is set in this period. The introduction to this explains the situation of the plague in which it is set. How many brave men, how many fair ladies, how many gallant youths broke fast with their kinsfolk, comrades and friends in the morning, and when evening came, supped with their forefathers in the old world. How many grand palaces, how many stately homes, how many splendid residences, once full of retainers, of lords, of ladies, were now left desolate of all, even to the meanest servant. How many families of historic fame, of vast ancestral domains, and wealth proverbial, found now no scion to continue the succession. Jouy de Chauliac, a French physician, wrote how the father did not visit the son, nor the son his father. Charity was dead, and hope destroyed. He served as physician to Pope Clement VI, and gave the following account of the plague to the Papal Council. The great death toll began, in our case, in the month of January, 1348, and lasted for the space of 7 months. It was of 2 kinds. The first lasted 2 months, with continuous fever and spitting of blood, and death occurred within 3 days. The second lasted for the whole of the remainder of the time, also with continuous fever, and with ulcers and boils in the extremities, principally under the armpits and in the groin, and death took place within 5 days. And it was of so great a contagion, especially when there was spitting of blood, that not only through living in the same house, but merely through looking, one person caught it from the other. Here is a chronicle written at the Cathedral Priory of Rochester in the 1300s. dealing with everyday life during the Black Death. A great mortality destroyed more than a third of the men, women and children. As a result, there was shortage of servants, craftsmen and workmen, and of agricultural workers and labourers, that a great many lords and people, although well endowed with goods and possessions, were yet without service and attendance. Alas, this mortality devoured such a multitude of both sexes, that no one could be found to carry the bodies of the dead to burial, but men and women carried the bodies of their own little ones to the church on their shoulders, and threw them into mass graves, from which arose a stink that it was barely possible for anyone to go past a churchyard. The superstitions of the time also caused high authorities to declare the plague to be given a number of unlikely explanations or acts of God. Under Philip VI of France, the medical faculty of the University of France claimed, "In the year of our Lord, 1345, there was a major conjunction of 3 higher planets in Aquarius. Indeed, this conjunction being the cause of the ruinous corruption of the air that is all around us, is a harbinger of mortality and famine. We believe that the present epidemic or plague originated from air that was corrupt in substance. The seasons have not been regular. There have been seen many vapour trails and flare-ups, such as a comet and shooting stars. The colour of the heavens has customarily appeared yellowish, and the sky turned red. There has been lightning flashes, thunder and earthquakes. All these things seem to come from a great rottenness of the air and land." The survivors of the plague fared little better than the dead. Many had their lives completely ruined socially and financially, not to mention the devastating losses that those survivors suffered, with very few people not having their families devastated or even wiped out. Starvation was also likely for survivors, with no one left to work the land. Many villages never recovered, and the impact was felt for generations. Matteo Villani, an Italian historian who would die in a later plague epidemic in 1363, wrote vividly of how daily life changed so dramatically for the common folk, and how society itself was brought to its knees. Thus, almost the whole city, without any restraint whatsoever, rushed into disorderliness of life. Men dreamed of wealth and abundance in garments and in all other things. Yet in fact things turned out wildly differently, for most commodities were more costly than before the plague. Lawsuits and disputes and quarrels and riots arose everywhere, among citizens in every land. Wars and scandals arose throughout the world, contrary to men's expectations. As people became more suspicious and paranoid, many sought scapegoats for the devastation that the plague had brought about. In some cases, Jews were accused of poisoning wells, and sometimes coerced through torture to confess to this. Violence and massacres against the Jews occurred in Europe, in Barcelona, Basel, Strasbourg, Frankfurt, and many other European cities. In fact, by 1351, there had been 350 incidents of anti-Jewish pogroms, and 60 major and 150 minor Jewish communities had been massacred. The Black Death did create discussion regarding the feudal system in place at the time, and due to a shortage of labour created by so much death, nobles began providing better working conditions, wages, and lower taxes to the peasants. It is interesting to see how life managed to carry on from such devastation, and how eventually, slowly, life did resume and society kept moving forward, even after such seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Certainly, looking at life during this time can make us appreciate all we have today, especially the medical advancements that have prevented another plague of this scale and this devastation from occurring again.